Thank you, Jim. And good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's a great day, isn't it? Come on now. It's a great day, isn't it? Now, if it was last Wednesday, and we knew what was coming the next few days, you know, it would be something, right? Anybody still without power this morning? I think we're making progress. We got Wilmont back on yesterday. How about Lakefield? Are they back up? Or you got back on? Good. We were out for 4 days in Fulda from Wednesday night until Sunday night. Interesting times. Like I've talked to a lot of people over the last few days at these meetings, and everybody has a story about this storm, right? So I won't bore you with mine, but interesting times. And like we were talking earlier, a lot of things that we take for granted. And power is definitely one of them, and it's something we just expected. Anybody here do what I did after day 4? You're still walking into rooms flipping the switch? I don't know why, but it just was habit, I guess. So anyway, we're going to get going today. We've got a lot of good information for you, I think. Our schedule was revised, so if you had looked earlier, you know, originally this meeting that we're having right now was supposed to be last Thursday at 9 o'clock. Of course, Thursday and Friday meetings were both canceled because of the weather. So now we're kind of touch and go as we go. This afternoon's meeting at Wilmont, up until this morning, we didn't know if we were going to have it or not because they didn't have power until about 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. And then tomorrow we're back on schedule. Well, actually not. The meeting tomorrow here at Brewster was originally supposed to be last Friday here in Brewster. So we always try and have a morning and an afternoon so people that with their schedules and stuff could to fit in, but we just couldn't do it this time, so I apologize for that. And the reason we're not having any meetings on Friday is it's Good Friday, and that's a pretty important holiday with a lot of people, you know, so we didn't want to infringe on that. Besides that, I'm planning on taking Friday off, okay? After last week with the weather and 8 meetings this week, we're probably going to take a couple hours off and go see the grandkids on Friday. So as we go through the meeting today, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to start out, and I know you guys aren't always real excited to see these numbers from the USDA reports, but we have to do that to kind of get a baseline and make sense of the other things we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about the April 9th supply and demand reports from the USDA. A week ago yesterday, so those are fairly fresh. This April supply and demand report is always very important because it's following up the grain stocks report that comes out the end of March. And that was on the 29th. So that's got a little bit of age to it, but it's very important, and we'll talk a fair amount about that. Also on the 29th, planting intentions report for the 2019 crop. And we sit here today on the 17th of April, and I know a lot of people would like to be getting stuff ready or possibly even out there scratching around in the fields, and we're a ways away from that. And actually quite a bit of the country's in that situation. So this is an intentions report, but the market does trade the numbers regardless. We're also going to look at South American production estimates. A key part, because we all know that we're in a very global market right now with grain and everything these days. And this is especially important this year because the stocks in the U.S. are not real conducive to better prices. So we need to see what our competitors are raising, and we also need to look at the demand side of the world and where's that going, and that kind of gets into this USA and China trade negotiations. We'll bring you up to date with what we're hearing from our contacts and the status of these things, some of the sticking points. You may be aware of this, so if nothing else, it's a good review, but hopefully we have some new light we can shine on that stuff. You know, since then, there's other negotiations starting to bubble up in the news. It's not just with China. The U.S. is also in the process now of beginning trade negotiations with the European Union. And of course, that's going to get real interesting because the one thing they don't want to talk about is agriculture. And that's what we want to talk about. So that's going to be in the news more. The new NAFTA agreement between Mexico and Canada, which we thought was all taken care of months ago, has not been ratified by any of the Congresses yet, including our own. And now there's talk that they may not pass it because we have so much gridlock in Washington. So trade is a very key thing. This is in the center of the agenda, and this is probably, honestly, I think this is the most important piece of the meeting. I know you want to know what the prices are going to do, but folks, this ASF, or African swine fever in China, this is a global event that, quite honestly, could be life-changing for a lot of people. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about that. I don't know how familiar you are with it. I don't know if you know what it could mean to China. And with China being the customer that it is for our corn, not our corn yet, but soybeans especially, and corn and soybeans from South America, this could be a big thing. And it's labeled by many as the story of the year in 2019. I'm going to tell you something right now. This is just the beginning. This is a story that we could be talking about for 2 to 5 years. Very, very serious. We want to spend some time on that. Weather for the growing season, we know what it's like right now. We'll look at forecasts for the balance of April, first half of May. You might be sitting here today saying, gosh, you know, with all of this rain and more in the forecast and I can't get anything done, we're not planting corn anywhere. How come we don't have some risk premium in this market? Well, you guys, it's easy to plant this crop, right? What do we got, 120 or 220 row planters now? That's a joke, but that's the mindset of the market right now. The market believes, don't worry, be happy, because the U.S. farmer can plant most of their corn in 3 to 5 days. That's the attitude. Now, I'm not saying that's right, but that's why the market right now is choosing to ignore it. It could be a factor, but we don't know today. We'll look at corn and soybean price outlook, both old and new crop. And then as far as grain marketing tips, this is a question we've started discussing more and more at some of our small group meetings. You know, what is the market telling us? We tend to make marketing way too complicated. When I started in the business almost 40 years ago now, a gentleman that was retired, that was very senior, gray hair and the whole 9 yards, said, Dan, he said, I'm going to tell you one thing. To be successful in grain merchandising, you need to keep things simple. I said, how do you do that? He said, well, you listen to what the market's telling you. And if you listen to the market and stay disciplined, you're not going to have as many problems. Your life is going to be good. You're going to be successful. If you listen to the market and ignore it or want to do your own thing, that's when you get into problems. So we're going to look at that at the end. So stay awake, because that's going to be something that's interesting. I know this group is not bashful. So if you have questions or comments, please bring them up at any time. The only thing I ask is don't throw anything at me, okay? I did a meeting for the Wyndham Farm and Home Show on the 6th of April, which was rescheduled because of a blizzard when it was originally supposed to be. And I was dubbed with a new nickname. Now, you guys are going to find this hard to believe, but they introduced me as Disaster Dan. I don't know how to take that, because I'm trying to share the truth with you, but you know, apparently a lot of times it comes across that some of this stuff is on the negative side. So I'll try to put the Disaster Dan hat away at least a few times as we go through this stuff. Okay, let's get started with the numbers. We're going to try and go through these fairly quickly, but you need to have them explained, and if you have any questions, make sure you let me know. We're going to start out from your right-hand side, second column in, because we want to look back at corn and soybean stocks from a year ago on March 1 to see what is the trend. How are the stocks doing? Are they getting bigger or smaller? Last year on March 1st, corn stocks 8.89 billion bushel. The average trade estimate going into that report on the 29th was 8.33. So the market was expecting about 500 to 600 million less bushels of corn on hand than a year ago. And as the corn stocks go down, what should we expect prices to do? Gradually work higher. And we've actually seen that, you know, prior to the 29th. Well, kind of a bombshell. USDA came out with 8.605, 270 million bushel higher than the average trade estimate, and only down a fraction of what we expected it to be from a year ago. That was a very bearish number. Now you say, well, how can this be? And the market is still trying to get their arms around this thing, because if you find more corn stocks like you do here in this March report, it usually means one of two things. Either the feed residual category was overstated, but that's hard to accept, because did we put our animals on a diet in the last year? Because we have more chickens, more pigs, more cattle on feed, but this is saying that we used a whole lot less corn. So maybe that isn't the answer. The other one might be, and this is where the market's trying to figure things out, you either overstated on feed residual or you understated your crop. Well now, remember we were supposed to have the final crop report for 2018 in January, but Washington was what?
Shut down.
Washington was shut down, so that report was delayed until February 8th. Well, by gosh, you'd think they would have had it right by then. And here we come out on March 29th, and it looks like they missed it. So we have to wait and see. Now, if you're a farmer and an eternal optimist, here's what you're hoping for. That this number was wrong in March, and on the next stocks report, they get it right. But that doesn't come until the end of June. So you see you've got 3 months here where the market has to wonder, is this right or not? Somebody at a meeting yesterday, and it was after the Wyndham meeting, came up afterwards, and he made a valid point. He said, because if you remember from previous meetings, my new friend Johnny Mack, who's convinced that last year's corn crop was smaller than what the USDA had said, still is today, and I believe it was smaller than that, but this gentleman over there said, you know, he said, I'm going to just speak for our area around Mountain Lake. And when those years were really good and we had $5 and $6 and $7 corn, he said, I'm going to be honest, people around our area made a lot of money. And they kept a lot of that money, or they built bins. So he said, you know, part of this corn stock situation could be not from the 2018 crop, but maybe some 17 that wasn't sold, some 16 that was still out on the farm. And we got to talking about that after the meeting, and Jim and some of the other originators said, you know, that makes sense, because last year, which the corn you had in the bin would have been the 2017 crop, record crop for most people, fantastic crop, but the growing season in 2018 wasn't all that great around here, right? And most people were expecting smaller corn crops, and he said, we know a lot of our customers that didn't sweep their bins last year. So when they harvested, they just put the 18 crop on top of the 17 that was left. Why not? Well, maybe then all of a sudden that's part of the reason why we find that we had more corn than what we thought. But this is something we have to work with. Now, whether we believe the number or not, what is the market going to do with it? It's going to trade it. And that's one of the reasons why you've seen the corn market really kind of struggle since the end of March. What this tells us, 8.6 billion bushel of corn on hand on March 1st, there's no reason to get excited about being short corn between now and next new crop, because we got plenty to get us there. Okay? What about beans? 2.1 billion bushel on hand last year on March 1. Trade was expecting 2.68. Remember, most of 2018 started back in April and May. We got into a trade war with China, our number one soybean customer. We were exporting less beans, and they expected the stocks to grow because we had a good crop last fall and lower demand. Well, the USDA came out pretty close at 2.716, but the bottom line is 5 to 600 million more bean stocks than a year ago. And we said on corn, if the stocks are getting smaller, price should go up. So what if we add 5 to 600 million beans? What should we expect out of beans? Probably still wondering why we're at the prices we are, to be honest with you. Okay, a little different perspective. March 1 corn stocks, historical perspective for the last 20 years. That 8.6 is up near the top. So once again, plenty of corn to get us to new crop. The USDA also looks at where these stocks are located, and they break them down between what's on the farm and off the farm. So here's our stock number from last year, 8.89 total stocks. This year, 8.6. So total corn stocks in the country are down a couple hundred million bushel. On this map, the states in yellow have less total corn stocks than a year ago. States in green have more. And then they go to the farm. And here's where it gets interesting. I'm going to say it again. Less total corn stocks than a year ago from 18 to 19. But look at the on-farm stocks. 5.002 last year, 5.131. Wait a minute, we said corn stocks were down, but there's 129 million more bushel on the farm than a year ago. Is that bullish or bearish most years?
Bearish.
47% of the corn left in the country on March 1 was still on the farm. When I look at this information and the market looks at this information, this can have implications as far as basis, right? Because it's April 17th today. We've got May, June, July, August. We've got 4 months, maybe a little bit into September. But basically in the next 4 months, what is going to happen to this corn on the farm? The majority of it? It's going to move to town. It's going to move to the market. So now this marketing window from last fall is down to 4 months. And I'm going to tell you when we get to the end of the presentation, I think we have an opportunity staring us right in the face today on corn basis. Because it's as narrow as it's been in years. And with this information on on-farm corn stocks, it should not be, and probably will not be for the next 4 months. So keep that in mind. What about soybeans? This looks like it's a misprint. 2.6 billion bushel of March 1 bean stocks. We've never been here before. Jim and I were at a meeting in early March, and one of the smartest guys I know in the business was giving a presentation on corn and beans. And he gave price indications. You know, with the Dodd-Frank rules, he has to be very careful what he says, because anything he says can and will be held against him. So he gave indications for old and new crop corn. He gave indications on old crop beans. And when he got to new crop beans, the screen was blank. And everybody said, your screen's not working. He said, no, it is. He said, I can't even tell you what I think the bean market might be for new crop because I can't justify it. And with the regulations, I have to be able to look at past history and say, this is what we did in the past, this is what we may do this year. We've never been here before. So the market doesn't really know how to handle it. Like we did with corn, here's total bean stocks, 2.1 billion last year, 2.7 this year. Every state that raises soybeans has more total bean stocks than a year ago. When we go to on-farm, we see the same thing. Look at this, folks. Last year, 855 million bushel on the farm on March 1. This year, 1.27 billion. So who's holding these extra corn and bean stocks this year? The farmers. Once again, implications to basis. Do you think it's going to be easier or harder for an exporter trying to buy soybeans this year, or a crush plant like M&SP or Fairmont? A lot of beans out there, right? And even though the bean stock number was fairly close to the estimate, that's why beans have struggled the last couple of weeks, because the market's looking at this and saying, it's going to be easy to buy beans from the farmer for the next 4 months, because there's a lot of them out there unpriced. Any questions on that? Okay.
If that's the
yes.
case, why is the basis as narrow as it is? Obviously, they're trying to get this stuff, corn and beans.
Excellent question. I didn't pay him to ask that, by the way. Why? What's the main reason? When basis is tightening and you have adequate stocks, what would be a reason that why it still keeps tightening? Lack of farmer selling.
I thought it was because you guys like this.
Well, that too. That's the number one reason. Number two is the fact that the market's not selling. If we looked at our balance tables, you know, we see like on corn, I think it's like close to 1.2 billion bushel a month that we use. You know, so it takes a lot of corn to keep everything operating. And when corn's not moving, how many guys have wanted to sell corn this winter? Cold, snow, now mud. But you know, you still keep making feed, you still keep making ethanol. Exports haven't been real fancy, but you know, the biggest thing I think is the lack of farmer selling. Now, if you want to play devil's advocate and say it's not because of lack of farmer selling, then you have to go into the camp that say that corn stocks number is wrong and the corn's not there, right? And nobody's going to, even though I kind of believe that might be true, I don't think you're going to get you're not going to get much support right now because the market's going to trade those numbers. Okay?
My thought is, what's going to happen in July and August when they
I agree.
basically, I got to get these bins empty.
That's my point. I think, you know, when we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but when we get to the end, we're going to look at that basis today, and I agree with you 100%. Well, I'll tell you right now. Nearby corn right now, the basis is 15 under. 1.5. Do you know what it was a year ago in April? 40 to 45. That's an opportunity, because I think between now, when we get to June, July, and August, we may be back at last year's levels. Especially when we get into South America and talk about what they have coming for increased competition on corn this year. Folks, the Argentina and Brazilian corn crop is bigger than a year ago. And they are going to export it against us.
Why aren't farmers selling when loan renewals are becoming more and more difficult and so on too? Why are they not selling?
Can't answer that, but it's a good question. I think part of it is because right now, once again, going back to the story from the Mountain Lake farmer, the ag industry, if you were a farmer through those really good times and you didn't have a lot of debt, a lot of people took advantage of that and paid off debt and stuck some away. And now when we run into these lean times, which we thought would be 1 year, but now it's 3 years and going into the 4th year, we're using up some of that equity that we had maybe put away for our retirement. But my concern, I think a concern of a lot of the ag lenders and really even the government with the health of the ag economy is, okay, we lived off our equity for the last few years, but we're kind of running low now. Tank's about empty. And the next year could get real challenging if we have so-so yields and marginal prices, right? Okay, moving on to prospective plantings. So bottom line out of the stocks report, very negative on corn, neutral to negative on beans. On the acres, we'll take you over here way on the right-hand side. This is what was planted last year for corn and beans, 2018. Remember, this was the first year where we actually planted more beans than corn in the U.S. So basically, acres were pretty much unchanged. Now, as we went through the year, we've seen this trade war build these bean stocks because our exports are down. Bean stocks are up. So the market's been saying since last harvest, you know, when we get to 2019, the American farmer needs to plant more what? Corn. Not that it works. You didn't have good corn prices that you could justify planting more corn, but you thought you'd get a better chance of making money on corn versus beans. So the market was expecting an increase of corn acres. The average trade guess was up about 2.2 million acres. USDA came out at 92.79. 3.6 million more corn acres than a year ago. That was double whammy on negative side of corn. Stocks, more than enough stocks to get us to new crop, and then all of a sudden we're going to add 3.6 million acres of corn? Yes?
Are the I states behind in their corn planting at this point? Or are they on?
Yes, but they don't care. Like I said earlier, the attitude of the market, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. When we get to the weather section, I'll show you the forecast for last half April, and it doesn't change a whole lot from what we've had. Maybe not quite as much moisture, but cool and wet. But you get to the first 10 days of May. The forecasts today show below normal precip and above normal temps. And the market's saying, we don't care if we plant corn in April because we can get it done in 5 days of May. So that's the attitude today. I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's the mindset of the market. So, double whammy on corn, negative side because with this type of acreage number, if we have decent weather in 2019 and actually plant that, corn stocks will probably do what next year? Get smaller or bigger? Probably get bigger. See, so that we kind of take the wind out of the sail for the old crop side with grain stocks, and we put a lot less concern about next year with that many acres. What about beans? Last year, 89.1. The market was looking for about 3 million less, and the USDA gave us a little bit of a neutral to a friendly number, 84.6, about 1.5 million less than what the trade was expecting, and over 4 million down from a year ago. But that doesn't make beans bullish. It just possibly makes beans a little bit less bearish. Once again, we have to look to South America and find that the Brazilian crop is pretty good, and the Argentina crop is much better than a year ago. So it doesn't give us a whole lot of hope for beans either, but we'll look at these numbers as we go forward. Here's how these intentions numbers were put together, and I want to remind you, one thing I will guarantee you, is this is an intentions report, and these numbers will change. They change every year. The intentions information was gathered from basically from late February to about mid-March. It was released then on the 29th. Then we have about a month, usually most years, that we wait for field work to really start picking up. And then we can kind of see the normal corn and soybean planting progression. Then from roughly Memorial Day to about mid-June, they'll resurvey, and then the end of June we'll get the final planted acres report. So that will come down the road here. Another thing I want to point out here, the principal crops, we'll look at what they all consist of at the end of probably about 3 or 4 slides from now, but basically it's almost everything that farmers raise, from corn, beans, wheat, sorghum, cotton, all the way down to some of the smaller crops, the minor crops. But what I want to show you here, we look at the last 20 years going back to 1999. Here's your planted acres, total planted acres of the principal crops. What's the trend? Then how come we have burdensome stocks? Yield. Technology, right? Better management practices, better genetics. That's a fact. Now, here's your planted acres, here's your harvested acres, and you see there's always a gap. There's always acres that fail. There's always corn acres that are planted, maybe harvested for silage and not harvested for grains. So that's not a harvested acres. And I bring this up because there's always about 1 to 2 million acres of corn, especially that it runs into this prevented plant category. Because we've had a lot of questions. Well, what about this stuff in Nebraska and western Iowa that got flooded out? Here's the answer of the marketplace. If you look at all the damaged acres, it's about 1 million acres. Big deal? Well, it's a real big deal if you're one of those farmers. But if you're planting 180 million corn and soybean acres, does 1 million acre really make a difference? And that's the attitude of the market. Bad for the people involved, but the response from the market is, it happens every year. It's just not always the same place. When we look at a map, boy, this looks like an election map, doesn't it? Reds and blues. And I was reminded just the night before last on I don't know which network it was, but one of the news, the gal was on there and she said, do you realize that we are only 19 months away from the next presidential election? Only. And we're hearing about it already. Anyway, here's a principal crop map. This is what I want to point out. Just from last year to this year, in this intentions report, we see the principal crop acres number down 4.2 million acres. Do you really think we're going to take that much land out of production from last year to this year? Or might some of these acres creep back in that final report in June? And I don't mean to sound negative here, but I'm going to put my Disaster Dan hat on for just a second. If we have a late spring, more of those acres could end up being planted to what? Soybeans. And does the soybean market need more acres? So we have to be kind of careful of that as we go forward. Here's our corn map. Oh, by the way, I just flip back one second here. You notice the only blue state that really matters is North Dakota. Everybody else planting less. When we look at the corn map, all of these blue states are intending to plant more corn acres than a year ago. Now, not a big deal right around us in Minnesota, 100,000, so we're pretty much going to stay at our normal rotation, and that's what we've been telling people. But look at this. Out of the 3.6 million increase in corn acres, 1.6 comes from the Dakotas. Very high percentage. Now, if you believe the numbers and if they get all of that stuff planted, if I want to be honest, and I'm putting a table together at the USDA, I'm going to have to be a little bit suspect what I do for yield, right? Because with almost half of your acre increase coming from lower yielding states, it's definitely not going to yield what the I states do, right? Or even Minnesota. So we'll see what they do right now. In May, we'll get the first crop yield estimates from the World Crop Board, but that's a few weeks away yet. Soybeans, all of the states in red intending to plant less, and that's just about all the states, down 4.5 million from a year ago. You can see Minnesota projected to be down about 500,000 in this intentions report. I'm going to take that with a grain of salt Because this time of the year, like up in the Red River Valley, what would the farmers be wanting to plant? Well, beets, and how about spring wheat? And a lot of flooding and wet conditions up there, and I read something the other day, oh, don't worry about that. Yeah, we haven't planted any spring wheat in northern Minnesota yet, but they'll plant that up to the 1st of June. I don't know if I believe that, but that's the attitude of the market. I think possibly this bean number could creep a little bit higher even in Minnesota. Here's our principal crops, if you're interested what they all consist of. I just like this chart from the USDA because it gives us the winners and the losers. If you're to the right side of this bar, the acres increase, so corn is up substantially, hay up a little bit, and then a lot of the minor crops, and of course the biggest loser was soybeans at 4.5 million. Any questions on the prospective planning report? Okay, here's our supply and demand tables from our April report last Tuesday. We're going to start out by looking at where we were a month ago, before the quarterly stocks reports came out. And that's on this line right here. Our March 8th supply and demand report by the USDA had ending stocks of corn at 1.835 billion bushel. If you were at our last meetings, you probably sensed that something had happened because Disaster Dan was actually friendly to the corn market. Well, why? Because at a 1.8 billion bushel carryout, we really thought that by now we'd have an agreement with China, and there might be a possibility they'd take a little bit of corn because they've been indicating that through the trade negotiations. And there was talk that they could take up to 400 million bushel of corn. And if they did, this carryout would go down to 1.4, and folks, we'd be back to $5 corn futures. Then comes the stocks report, where we find 270 million more than the trade thought, and over 300 million more than what we were expecting. Less of a decrease from a year ago. So now all of a sudden the ending stocks on corn back above 2 billion bushel. And that's a psychological thing where once again the market's not concerned. We've got plenty of corn to get to new crop. We've seen now that we have plenty of acres, so we're not too worried about that. How did they raise it up? Well, they cut feeding 75 million. They cut ethanol 50 million for March and exports 75 million. They took demand down 200 million to kind of get this back in line with what the stocks number said. But keep something else in mind, folks. That stocks number was somewhere 270 to over 300 million more than what we thought, and the government adjusted for 200. If that number was right, what might be happening in future supply and demand reports? Demand might be what? Cut further. And if that happens, what might happen to this 2.035? Might get bigger. I know that's not what you want to hear, but you guys need to be aware of this because this is a very significant change. What about soybeans? Well, in March, the carryout was projected at 900 million, lowered to 895. Whoopee-doo, right? They took imports down 5 million, seed up 2, so demand was down, adjusted 5, and that gave us a little bit lower ending stock number. And just to remind everybody, when we talk ending stocks or carryout on grains, that's what's left over on August 31st, the end of the USDA crop year. So this is kind of like our beginning number for the next crop year. Wheat we're not going to talk about because there's just too much of it. Then we go to just briefly look at the world. And now we shift from bushels to million metric ton. So you don't have to do any conversions. Just look at how the numbers changed from March to April. Here's corn, 308 in March, 314 in April. What happened? Bigger corn crop in Argentina, bigger corn crop in Brazil, bigger corn crop in Ukraine, and larger corn stocks in the US. So that's basically how that increased. This is not the trend we want to see. We'd like to see demand higher than production so that ending stock number comes down for the world. Soybeans pretty much unchanged from month to month, but this is a more than adequate number for the world. And the market is concerned that soybean stock number for the world grows because of reduced demand in China, the #1 soybean customer for all of the world. Wheat, we've got too much wheat, just like in the U.S., and those stocks increased from month to month also. Okay, now to South America. When we look at their final crop from a year ago, and here's Brazil on the, or excuse me, Argentina on the left, Brazil on the right, and here's their current crop year and how the yields have progressed from recent reports by the USDA. Now we have to remind ourselves that a year ago, Argentina was in a very serious drought, the worst drought in the nation's history. So they had very short crops. Corn crop last year in Argentina of 32 million metric ton. Projected this year at 47 million metric ton. You notice that it was even raised from March to April. Last year Argentina was too dry. This year for a while they were too wet, but now the crop is much better. So just from Argentina, the world is going to have 15 million metric ton more corn than a year ago. I want to remind you that Argentina is the #2 corn exporter in the world, behind the US. So are they going to be more or less of a competitor in the year to come? What about Brazil on corn? 82 million last year, projected around 94, more acres planted. So far the weather's been good. Their second crop of corn, their summer corn, their safrinha crop was planted earlier than normal. Conditions are good, and because of that, the USDA is starting to inch that number up. So if you compare Brazil's crop, it looks like about 14 million metric ton more than a year ago. When you add those two together, is it a big deal? Well, I'll let you decide that. Increased corn production this year versus last year out of Brazil and Argentina, if we convert it to bushels, is 1.2 billion bushels. Is it going to be easier or harder for the U.S. to export corn in the coming months? Harder. And your points, sir, about the basis and what it might do in June, July, and August. When will Brazil and Argentina have this corn in position to export? Not quite that early, but July and August for sure. So all of a sudden this marketing window that we have from now until September to empty the bins, now we've got more competition from the southern hemisphere. So when I look at that basis today and what it might be in 3 to 4 months, if I'm a producer, I think I want to be a little bit proactive and maybe try and get ahead of it. What about beans? Once again, due to the drought, a year ago, 37.8 was the soybean crop in Argentina. This year projected at 55. So 18 million metric ton more beans than a year ago out of Argentina. That's all weather. On Brazil last year, they had a record crop of 122. Remember at our last meeting, I think we talked about the fact that they had a lot of dry spots in Brazil. The crop was shrinking. Well, guess what happened? It started raining. And we know how resilient soybeans can be. We've had that happen to us, right? So all of a sudden now, this crop that was taken at one time from 122 down to 111, 112, now you see all of a sudden it started to creep higher. The Brazilian harvest is well advanced, almost finished, and what they're finding, the yields were surprisingly better than expected. Now we're not going to get up to last year's crop, but it's better than what it was. So if you gained 18 in Argentina and lose 5 in Brazil, Brazil and Argentina still have more beans than a year ago, correct? To compete against us. In a market that now looks like is suffering from a little bit of a slowdown in demand from the #1 customer in China. Any questions on this?
You are full of good ones, aren't you?
I tell you, you know, when you don't have power for 4 days, you have no TV, your cell phone only lasts until the battery goes dead.
The house is cold.
The house is cold, and you're with your wife that you've been married to for 40 years. What do you do? I tell you, I think we talked more, had more conversations than we had in many, many years, because what are you going to do? And I'll tell you something else. I don't know, when you're out on the farm, I know you can appreciate this because you're out in the middle of nowhere. But when you live in a small city, even like Fulda, when nobody has power, when the sun goes down, it gets what?
Pretty dark.
It gets pretty dark. And you can't read because, I don't know how these people did it years ago, because you try and read with a candle and that doesn't work, and you got no lights, and so I guess you just go to bed and put another blanket on, right? Because you try and stay warm, but interesting times. So a lot of times to think about this stuff, and I was trying real hard to come up with positive news, and we'll get to some, but we want to be honest about it, right? Because you guys need to make intelligent decisions, and sometimes the news isn't always what we want it to be, but we have to live with it and move on. We're going to take a little look here now on the usage categories of corn and beans, and the big ones we're going to just kind of highlight, since the feeding number is just something that the government backs into. We're going to start out with exports to see once, because now we've agreed that, according to the USDA numbers, Brazil and Argentina are going to have more corn to export in the coming years. So let's see once how we're doing. This looks at a table that comes out each Monday. I received this, and it looks at world corn FOB offers. And this would be something that if you were a buyer of corn, doesn't matter if you're Japan, South Korea, any buyer of corn in the world looks at something like this. And they look at the four main players. Because really, if you're going to buy corn in the world, you have four choices, but really it's three, and really it's two. Number one exporter of corn is always the U.S. Number two is Argentina. Number three is Ukraine, but quite small. And Brazil will on occasion, but you know, they're not always there because their focus has been on beans. But now this year maybe a little bit more because they've raised more corn. So here's your prices per metric ton. Once again, don't worry about the conversion to a bushel price. Just look at how they compare. And here's your months that you may be looking to buy corn in: May, June, July, and August. So for May corn, $167 a ton out of the U.S., $156 out of Argentina. Where are you going to buy corn if you're a buyer of corn in the world? Well, that's...
Depends on what the freight is.
Yeah, I understand that, but this is kind of bringing this stuff all together. So we're going to treat the freight as fairly similar, because in most cases it is. What about June? Maybe this was just an irregularity here. What about June? Spread gets wider.
Yeah.
What about July? What's happening? You see, as we get a little bit farther down the calendar, the new crop is getting harvested in Argentina and get it moved into an exportable position, right? What does this tell us? With 15 million more metric ton of corn, which is about a little over 500 million bushel, Argentina raises corn to do what with it? Sell it, export it. They crush their beans into meal and oil, but they sell the corn. So they will price, the Argentina market will price it whatever it takes to take business away from who? Us. And have we seen that in recent weeks? It's already writing on the wall. That's why this is like the third report in a row where the USDA is inching down the corn exports out of the U.S. Now, the frustrating thing about this is, for this first 4 or 5 months of this crop year, we had the cheapest corn in the world. And for some reason, the demand wasn't there. So, you know, we've got a little bit of an uphill battle here on that. A little different perception of this. Here's Argentina corn in blue, Brazil in red, U.S. corn in green, Ukraine or Black Sea in purple. And you can kind of see Argentina's going to price that corn well below everybody else because they raised it, they're going to move it and take the money and run. So when that, out of the big four then, probably see an increase in exports out of Argentina, Brazil, and the Ukraine, and of course U.S. then. There's only so much business out there. If that happens, we'll see U.S. exports decline. What about ethanol out of the U.S.? This looks at a weekly chart, and the blue line is last year, 2017-18, where we had a very strong year of ethanol production, corn used for ethanol. The seasonal weekly chart is this copper color, and this green is where we're at so far this year. Now, we started out the year pretty good, but as we went forward, we started building ethanol stocks and not exporting as much, and stocks are at very, very high levels right now. So as that happened, margins turned negative. Also back, if we look at this late last year, 2018, what happened to the price of crude oil? It dropped. It was down, what, $40 roughly? And we were loving it because gas was cheap. But when crude oil goes down that low, what kind of is drug along with it? Ethanol. And the margins were negative, so you had plants shutting down or slowing down because of poor margins. And now crude oil is back to $63, $64 a barrel. Ethanol has went higher, but we're still not really seeing the grind pick up that much because we still have too many stocks. Part of the problem with this, the high ethanol stock inventory that we have in this country, and that's driven partly by government policy, because quite a few years ago they came out and said our cars needed to have better what? Fuel economy, mileage per gallon. So we're using less with better cars, and the fact of the matter is the Americans are driving less. So gas demand is down, and if you're putting 10% blend into gas and you're using less ethanol, right? And the other side of that is the technology to try and sacrifice margins and keep things profitable. We went to a few years ago when they were getting 2.6 to 2.7 gallons of ethanol out of every bushel of corn, and now that's up to almost 3. So out of the same bushel of corn now we're getting more ethanol because of improved technology and manufacturing practices. So, yes?
Supposed to be going to 15%?
Well, there's talk about that, but you know, we've got to get the government to go along with that. And then the challenge is going to be, the biggest challenge with going to a 15% blend is if you're going to make that everybody, then you can use the same pumps. But if you're going to have 10% and 15%, a lot of these stations aren't equipped to handle both. It's just like E85. So it's supposed to be coming, but you know, it's one of those things. Who's trying to slow down the 15% ethanol blend? Oil companies. And they don't have any money to waste with lawyers, do they? I mean, it's supposed to happen. We'll see if it does.
Cash price of gas is 70 cents a gallon higher than it was in December.
Yep. Yeah, I know. Yesterday when we went, I wish I could have stored gas last night because Jackson, Wyndham, everybody was $2.79. Got back to Fulda, was $2.64. Tanks were full. I could only hold so much. But yeah, it's a lot higher. And that's probably going to slow down usage a little bit too, which doesn't help the ethanol side. So we've seen the USDA cut back on ethanol, and there's a possibility this comes down a little bit more if we go forward. Now, the one possibility here, I am in the camp that think the US and China, they're going to get this trade thing put together. And I am in the camp that believe if they do, there's a good chance that China's going to buy some US ethanol. And that could help. Not make it real bullish, but it could help a little bit. Yes, sir?
Won't that also have to go through the Congress, though?
I don't think so.
Why would that be any different than NAFTA?
Oh, the trade agreement. Oh, yeah, but
You and I are on the same page as far as
yeah,
Trump again, but I don't think.
yeah, but well, I don't know about that because Congress didn't approve the tariffs, did they? That we put on China?
No, I think that's what he did with his own.
Yeah, and I think if we start trading, I mean, if it's a real formal trade deal, you might be right, but I haven't heard anybody talk about that. If they agree in principle on what's going to do it, the market's going to trade accordingly. And I think there's demand in China for ethanol because China has a severe pollution problem, and the world is really leaning on China to clean it up. And they're in the process of building their own ethanol industry, but it takes time, and the easier way would be to buy U.S. ethanol. And they're probably not going to be able to buy it from Brazil. I just read something this morning where ethanol production in Brazil from the cane crop is lower than what they expect, so they really don't have anything to export right now. We do if we'd get something put together.
Can China afford their own corn?
Can they afford their own corn? We'll look at that in a minute. It's actually cheaper to buy U.S. corn. Remember what they have? Remember years ago when they had that program of paying their farmers crazy prices to raise corn?
Pictures of the
Yep.
corn stored on highways.
Yeah, well, they've used some of that up, but they still have, according to the Chinese government, they still have adequate stocks, but they've been trying to bring them down. Okay, same type of thing we want to look at on beans. If you're a buyer of beans in the world, and this is a little bit less negative than corn because there was a big spread between the other ones. If you're a buyer of beans in the world, you're probably going to look predominantly at Brazil and the U.S. Now, Argentina is up here, but we have to remind ourselves that Argentina has their crush plants on the coast. They take their whole beans to the plants, they crush them, add value themselves, and they sell meal and oil to the world. They don't they do not export a lot of whole beans. So they have a price up here, but it's not really probably very honest. So if we compare U.S. price of beans to Brazil, we see a little bit cheaper in Brazil, but as we get out into June and July, they're almost a wash. And why is that? Well, that's as they wind down their harvest and their supplies start getting a little bit tighter, then all of a sudden they come up to where the world market is. So it looks like the U.S. is close to being competitive on beans, but keep in mind that until we have these tariffs taken off, if you're China looking at U.S. beans, what do you have to add on to this price? 62%. Well, it's 25% on beans. I think it's 62% on DDGs. But, so that wouldn't happen. Now, that's only partially true. I tell you, China's kind of like our government. They can set a rule, but then they can choose to ignore it. So that tariff only applies if it's going into the private industry. If the government is buying beans for the Chinese reserve program, they don't charge themselves 25% because they said we would just be trading dollars. Why would the government charge themselves 25%? So any of these tariffs can be bypassed by China by saying they're buying it for their reserves, including pork, including DDGs, including ethanol. So that cloudies the water just a little bit. But, we're close to competitive on beans if we would get the tariff off. Prices kind of show that. Argentina is indicating that they're cheaper, but like I said, they pretty much crush everything. So the whole beans, it's Brazil and Argentina, or Brazil and the U.S., and Brazil's slightly cheaper right now. The other area of usage, like on corn, it's ethanol, is crushing on the soybean side. And this looks at a chart that has each month. In fact, just today's what? Wednesday. On Monday, we received the crush report for the month of March. Now, the gray bars are the all-time record amounts of beans crushed in a month going back to 2001. So and the red lines here, the blue line was last year. And you can see last year, other than the first month of September, every month without exception, we set a record in the U.S. for crushing soybeans. Why? Well, keep in mind, that South American crop, Argentina had a very short crop. They were the ones that were supplying a lot of meal and oil to the world. They didn't have the beans, so they couldn't crush them, so the U.S. was kind enough to step in and do that. Phenomenal crush margins for plants like AGP, MNSP, CHS. They made a lot of money last year. Now, you can see we started out this year now with the red bars, started out setting new records again, above last year's records, until we get to February. And now March is a little bit lower. What's happening? Crop is getting closer to being available in Argentina, see, and they're going to start taking some of that business back. So the crushing industry is going to probably be a little less aggressive in the U.S. than it was a year ago. More beans on the farm, less demand in the global market on the soybean side. So once again, that could have basis implications as we go forward. Because when we compare soybean meal prices in the world, Argentina and Brazil are way cheaper, like $20 to $25 a ton cheaper on soybean meal than U.S. meal. If you're a livestock feeder, this could be an opportunity. Because without the export draw that we had a year ago, soybean meal basis should be wider, making the meal cheaper than it was a year ago. Follow me there? Okay, now we're going to go to China. Before we talk about the trade deal, once again at this conference that we were at in early March, the gentleman included this in his corn and soybean presentation, and maybe I'm naive. I went to school in Fulda and I didn't pay a lot of attention, I'll be honest. But I wasn't aware of, or didn't really think much about the differences between our government and theirs. Now, I know they're communist and we're democratic and all that stuff, but this has to do with why it can be kind of difficult to get changes made on trade, and that's what we're going to talk about eventually. President Xi is the president of China, and he's the equivalent of our President Trump, right? Does President Trump have to answer to anybody in Washington? Now, just a minute. Besides Nancy Pelosi. A lot of people, right? What about the press? In this country, whether it's fake news or real news, the press can write anything they want, right? And get by with it. Can they do that in China? No. The official policy line, government line is put out, and that's what they must do. And if they don't, they probably won't have a job, and they may come up in this category called expired, right? So who does President Xi answer to? President Xi is one of the group of 7. So how many people does he have to keep happy? 6. 6. Literally, 6.
Himself.
Well, no, he has to keep the other 6, because if there's a dissension among the ranks of this group of 7, and 3 or 4 get together, they may decide to do what?
Somebody else.
Put somebody else in as president. And President Xi may no longer have a job, or may suddenly come up with a health issue. Lead poisoning? I don't know. So, you know, it's a different thing. And then there's a group of 50 that surrounds a group of 7. You know, these are people that are being trained or groomed possibly to someday step into this inner circle if they do the right things, make the right decisions, and you have another group. But the heart of the matter is, the group of 7 makes the policy decisions and sets the long-term goals for China. Is that different than the U.S.?
Yeah.
Drastically.
Yeah, first
So-
of all, they have long-term goals.
Well, that's right. And here's their goals. They want to be economic and military security is number 1. And they also want superiority in both of these things. They want to be the number 1 economy in the world. They want to have the number 1 military in the world. They want to be the number 1 country in the world. Does anybody else in the world have those goals? How about us? Do we want to be number 2 on military to China or Russia? So this is where we start getting into conflicts, because these goals are set by that inner group of 7, and they have no interest in compromising those long-term goals. Does that create a problem in trade negotiations with us? We have structural issues, intellectual property, you know, patent rights, all of these things that China thinks is good business. If you steal somebody's trade secrets, that's good business. And we think that's illegal. So, you know, they're willing to say that they want a trade agreement, but they don't want strong verification or enforcement policies. And that's when we have these talks tend to bog down. But it seems like recently we've made a little bit of progress in that China is kind of willing to sacrifice their farm sector, because as these negotiations have went down, one time they came in and bought 10 million metric ton of soybeans. We were not the cheapest. A month or 2 later, they came in and bought another 10 million metric ton of soybeans. These were goodwill gestures where they were not helping their farm sector, but they were trying to make the U.S. believe that they were interested in getting this deal put together. But once again, when it came down to actually finalizing the deal, the structural issues and the verification kind of stopped things. So where are we at right now? Well, in the last couple of weeks here, we've sensed, or the industry has sensed, a lot of progress, especially since the release of the Mueller report. Now, please don't be offended by this, and I'm not picking sides one way or the other, but I'm going to just be honest, because, folks, this is what happened. Previous 8 years of administration prior to President Trump, did we do anything to slow down the bad policies of China? In fact, we made it worse. And not just the U.S., the whole world. And the whole world knew in their gut that something had to be done to stop this and fix things. Enough was enough, right? And we didn't have a world leader or a country willing to step up and do that until President Trump. And I'm not saying he's polished, and I don't agree with everything he does, but he had the fortitude to put his foot down and said, enough, we're going to fix these things. What did China want this report to say? Impeach that there was collusion. President Trump never should have been elected, and he should be impeached and put out of office tomorrow. And what did the report say? No collusion, no evidence. In fact, there may be indications that the other side were doing illegal things to spy on the Trump campaign. Now, we aren't going to talk about that, but so this really took the wind out of the sail. And like I said earlier, 19 months until the next election. So now China's saying, we've got 2 more years of this guy. And he might get reelected. And then we could have 6 more years. You know what? Our economy is hurting from these tariffs, from President Trump's policies. We maybe better try and get this thing fixed. And you're starting to get a little bit of dissension in the ranks of that group of 7 because they see economic pain. China as a country is an exporting country. And when you put the tariffs on that we've put on in a lot of those products coming into us, does that have an impact on their economy?
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, are the tariffs that they put on affecting us? Yeah, but it's a small group because it's just who? Us. The farmers, the ag economy. And China knew that. And China also knew that the ag economy helped elect President Trump, and that's why they targeted ag products, because they're trying to make him look bad to prevent him from getting reelected. That's just kind of where it's at. Anyway, the enforcement language, still a sticking point. I can tell you this much. When you see an announcement that President Xi and President Trump have agreed on a date and a place, and it's actually going to happen, you will see an agreement. Until you see that, I don't care how many delegations go back between Beijing and Washington. There's no agreement until the 2 presidents are going to get together. Because like any politician, what are they going to want to do? Take credit for what we've accomplished. And that would be great if they get this thing put together. But you know, we were supposed to have this conference the end of March, and it's now the 17th of April, and there's nothing scheduled yet. And President Trump came out, a week or so ago saying, you know, it may take until June. And just like with these revisions to the reports, the market doesn't like to be patient. But here's a little bit of positive hope. As these things get, and they are getting closer to a resolution, I really believe that. There's talk that they could be interested in buying up to another 40 million metric ton of soybeans, 20 million metric ton of corn, DDGs from the U.S., ethanol from the U.S., and also possibly U.S. wheat. Total package of well over $1 trillion. Would that make progress in solving the trade deficit that we now have with China?
Yes.
The question is, though, and what hasn't been come out, is what's the time frame? If it's 10 years, okay, it helps, but it's not a lot. If it's 5 years, if it's 3 years, if it's 1 year, this number on corn keeps growing. 2 months ago, there was talk that China may be interested, if they get this trade agreement together, of 5 to 6 million metric ton of corn, which, you know, could make a difference, not a big deal. And then it went to 8 to 10. And now it's up to 20. I think there's a need there. And at some point, maybe China has to step up and get this thing done. Now, as we start talking about the African swine fever, believe it or not, that's buying China a little bit of time, because their demand is going the other direction right now. So if they had a need for corn, they may be able to wait and be a little bit patient. Yes?
Okay, we hear all the time somebody has canceled their orders. Apparently, if I cancel my order with New Vision, there's repercussions for that.
Absolutely.
But if I do it as another country, apparently there's no repercussions for that.
Well, I think,
So if
yeah.
China says they're going to buy 20 million
Right.
metric tons of corn,
Yep.
they say, okay, yeah, we're going to buy that, and then 6 months they say, oh, well, we're going to cancel that order.
Yep.
What's stopping them from,
Nothing.
yeah,
And we're going to look here in a little bit that the last few weeks, last month, I guess, they've had 2 very significant purchases of pork out of the U.S. Anybody here watched live hog futures the last month? They've almost doubled, haven't they?
Not quite, but
Not quite, they're getting close. And they haven't taken a pound of those purchases yet. So the market's wondering, are they serious, or are they just saying they're going to buy U.S. pork to try and enhance these trade negotiations? The only country that I know of that really gets by with what you're talking about is China. Most countries do live up to their deals, or there are repercussions. I don't know. I don't know how to explain that, but it's just something that we've allowed them to do. Yeah.
So we keep talking about US like we're the supplier.
Yep.
And China is the buyer.
Yep.
But in reality, there's no entity in the US government that actually sells corn. It's Cargills
Right.
and people like that. So except for this reserve that you talked about,
Yep.
aren't these private companies in China that are the buyers at this point?
No. When the previous purchases, as these trade negotiations have went on, when they came in and said they were going to buy 10 million metric ton of corn or beans, that was bought by the Chinese government. Or,
Under what program? They have a reserve.
yeah, they have a reserve program,
Yeah, but you
reserve
just-
stocks.
I take that aside.
Yeah.
You the ones talked about ethanol business.
Yep.
Way back in the day.
Yep.
And the people that ran the ethanol was separate from the government as far as purchasing corn.
Yeah, yes and no. You see, there's
They had a choice of not buying government corn.
right.
Or buying outside corn.
Yeah, that's kind of changed now, and there's a couple of marketing companies in China that are supposed to be private, but really are heavily influenced or controlled by the government. Kafka was one. You've probably heard that name. It's really a purchasing arm of the Chinese government, even though it's kind of made to look like it's a private company. So it gets a little bit murky over there with sometimes.
So the point I was
Yeah.
looking at is that when they cancel an order, they're canceling an order against maybe a Cargill or a
Yes,
Ford
exactly.
or somebody.
Yep. Well, and I think
Does that
that.
make Cargill pissed?
Oh, absolutely. Not only that, there's some severe financial damage. I don't know if it was this year, a year ago, or maybe even 3 years ago. That happened to CHS. Does anybody remember that? Used to be GTA, and now it's CHS up in St. Paul,
Yeah.
where they had, I think it was wasn't it soybeans, Jim? Where they had contracts on with China, and then they walked away from them, and of course the market had changed, and there were huge losses. And what are you going to do?
Not deal with it.
I mean, well, yeah, you can do that, but when they're the number one customer of the world, you kind of play by their rules, whether they're right or wrong, and that's what we've allowed to have happen, and that's what we want to try and part of what we want to try and fix.
Contracts that are written with Cargill, when they are written subject to cancellation without penalty, it's done before a certain date.
Probably. And the other thing that can happen is those contracts can be frame contracts. We don't have frame contracts here, so don't ask. A frame contract has no basis, no price, no quantity established. It's more of an indication that we intend to purchase these amounts if it works at the time. And you'll see China come in and do that. They'll come to the U.S. and say, oh, we're going to buy 20 million metric ton of soybeans. And then if you read the fine print and it's on a frame contract, it's not even worth the paper it's on until they actually do the deal. So here's corn. The question was, why doesn't a user in China just buy corn from the Chinese reserve? Well, they can, but here's how it stacks up. This gray line is the price of corn if you're a user in China and you're buying it from the government out of their reserve stocks. The blue line is if you're buying it from the U.S. and taking it off the West Coast, the PNW. And the copper line is if you're buying it from the U.S. and taking it out of the LA Gulf. So you see, if you take the tariffs away, U.S. corn is much cheaper than the corn they can buy from their own government. But that kind of makes sense. Because remember when the government built all these stocks, how much were they paying their farmers to raise that corn?
You said $10.
Yeah, $9 to $10 a bushel. Now that's coming down a little bit, but it's still much higher. It's a much higher cost. But what are you going to do? If you're a user of corn in China and they tell you you can't buy from the U.S., you have a lot of choices, don't you? Whole different world. Okay, before we get into the ASF, and the power thing and everything, you know, I just had to throw it in to kind of lighten things up a little bit. Nobody's experienced this, have they? Have we become not only too dependent on electricity, but on these phones? You know, Sunday morning we went down to Perkins and Worthington for some hot coffee because it was getting dang cold in the house. And you see people sitting in a restaurant, a couple sitting across from each other, both texting now. We don't know if they're texting each other or somebody else, but it's kind of crazy, isn't it? And every time we go to see our grandsons in Mankato, we're not a mile out of Mankato, and my wife says, can't they ever put those dang screens away? Because that's all the kids all have them, and that's all they want to do. So it was kind of nice during the ice and snowstorm to have the cell phones go dead, where you actually had to communicate and talk once in a while again, right? Okay, African swine fever. I don't know how familiar with it you are with it, but we're going to try and give you a little bit of an update. It's about as bad as it gets when it comes to hog diseases. It's not a new disease. It was first discovered in the early 1900s. There is still no cure or vaccination. None. If a hog comes down with African swine fever, it'll probably be dead within 10 days. It is spread easily from hog to hog. It is not susceptible, at least so far, where humans can catch it. But here's just a little bit on how serious it is as far as how long it can last and why it's so very hard to control. It can live in blood for months. It can live in manure for 14 days. It can live in processed sausage for 300 days. And it can live and be viable in frozen meat for 1,000 days. Do you see why it's so hard to control? Do you see why there was a big uproar and people were very concerned when a food shipment from China was stopped at the port of New Jersey containing ramen noodles that had pork flavoring in? When we were at this conference in early March, the people giving the livestock presentations were just adamant about the fact that it's very possibly not a matter of if this ever makes it to the U.S., it's when. Because we are so global nowadays, it could be very innocent, but sure. Yeah, the train. I don't know. It sounds like thunder to me. I don't know. I didn't mean what I said. I'm going to get struck here.
Hey, Dan,
Yes.
can that affect any size hog then?
Yes. In fact,
From sows to
yep. The estimates are right now, and we know we can believe the Chinese government's information, right? According to the Chinese government, they've already lost over 20% of their sows, which is very important if and when they get this thing under control to try and repopulate, right?
They're not gonna eat a lot of soybeans, are they?
Well, you're getting there. Don't get ahead of me now. This is how, you know, we talk about how this is spread and how it can be spread through meat. That's how it got into Vietnam, and it's in Vietnam right now. Some pork that was shipped from China to Vietnam. Now you have outbreaks in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, 3 in South Africa. And we see a press release here from the Chinese government about a week ago saying that the swine fever is gradually slowing and that it's now under effective control. Does that sound like a government policy or statement? But when you talk to people on the ground in China, they said it's like a raging wildfire. There's no end in sight, and they don't know what they're going to do. Jim's son works for one of the big drug companies in Omaha. They've been doing research on trying to get a vaccine for this thing for a long time, and not months, years. And it's kind of like a lot of the other diseases. You know, it has different forms and mutates, and it's just very tough to control. The big thing is China. When we look at a map of 2018 and 2019 wouldn't be much different. China has 55% of all the hogs in the world. And this is where the numbers start getting kind of staggering and should put a little bit of a fear into you, because here's China at 710, and we think we have a big industry, and we do in this country, and our numbers are 133. Now, granted, there's a fair amount of hogs in the European Union and stuff too, but you can see China is by far the big player. So what does this mean? Right now, the trade believes that China has lost at least 30% of their hogs and possibly up to 40 today, and it's not controlled yet. Now, I just read something from the Chinese government, or that they had put out, indicating that they think the loss so far is 16.1%. But like we've seen before, we don't know how reliable their statements are. What the people that think it's down 30 to 40% are basing that on the fact that that's what they see the feed and corn demand down. Because if you lose 30% of your hogs and you're not replacing them, what happens to your corn and meal demand? So if we look at production, prior to African swine fever, this is what China was projected to produce for world pork in 2019, 54 million metric tons. This figures a 40% reduction, which is maybe a little bit on the high side right now, but this is where INTL FC Stone was at with their number in the last month here. That would drop pork production in China from 54 million metric ton down to 32. You notice over here in our area, the US, Canada, and South America, we can add all of this together and it would not come close to filling the void created by the loss in China. And if you bring the European Union in and add another 24 million metric ton in from there, you can get close. But basically what happens is nobody else in the world could eat pork if you're going to give it back to China to replace that lost production. Is that possible? Do you see now why hog prices in the US have almost doubled in the last 30 days?
Does China export much pork?
Well, a little bit, but theoretically right now they should not be, because in the world,
To infect the world.
right. See, right now, if you report African swine fever in your country, the rules say your exports are now quarantined.
Well, I was just wondering, as far as their food consumption, I mean, that's going to have to be replaced if they don't export a lot of pork normally.
No. We'll get there, but yeah, and there's going to be changes coming. And before we get too far into this, I'm going to tell you something else right now. This has nothing to do with corn and beans, but if you have a freezer that's not plugged in and running at home, go plug it in and get to the grocery store and buy meat. Because I tell you something right now, if the price of live hogs have almost doubled in the last 30 days, do you think you're going to be able to buy pork loins cheap much longer? And if pork loins start going up, or China decides we're going to buy chicken, we're going to buy beef, are those prices going to stay down? This meat thing could be real interesting, not just for China. I mean, the whole world is going to have to respond to do this, because what is the one thing that China doesn't want?
Hungry people.
Hungry people. Because what do hungry people do? They revolt. I hate to say this, but this is scary enough where way back before our time, we read about wars being caused by what? Food shortages. This is a big deal, folks.
It's happening in Venezuela right now.
Exactly. Yep.
So you're kind of saying that my $8 hamburger at the truck stop is probably going to go to 12?
I don't know. I'm just saying it's probably not going to get cheaper. Probably not going to get cheaper. A little different way to look at it. We just see the drop in production for pork out of China. This is the European Union, so they could do that, but they're going to feed their people too. So this is going to create, some challenges for the world, because if we see a 40% reduction in Chinese pork, that takes an 18% decline in the whole world. Is that significant? And I just got this yesterday. So the previous 4 meetings didn't see this slide, but it brings home a couple of points that I threw it in this morning because I wanted to share it. The USDA, in their last report on April 9th dropped China pork production 10%. Well, we can believe their numbers, right? Well, it's the right step, but it's probably going to be another 10 or more percent. And here's the other thing that we have to be real cognizant of about this pork situation in China. It appears today, if you talk to people right now, you'd say, well, I don't know what you're talking about, because there's places in China today that have a surplus of pork. And you're saying they're short? Here's what's happening. About 42% of all the hogs raised in China, that huge number, are raised in small family-type farms. If your neighbor comes down with African swine fever, what are you going to do with the pigs that you have if that's your livelihood? What are you going to do before they get sick?
Sell them.
You're going to sell them. Or you're going to butcher them and sell the meat. So you see, you've actually got a supply surge right now because people are marketing hogs earlier so that they don't, because if they get sick and they have to tell the government that they have sick hogs, what is the government going to do with their remaining herd?
Kill them.
They're going to come in and kill them and burn them. And how much does the farmer get?
Nothing.
Well, I think they get a small stipend, but basically nothing. So their livelihood is gone. And that's one of the issues of trying to control it in China. Because if you're butchering sick pigs, people aren't getting sick. But here's how it works in China. You butcher a pig because you don't want it to get sick, so you have pork roast for supper. And you don't eat it all, so you put it in the garbage. We don't do that, do we? And what does the Chinese housewife? She throws it in the garbage, and they feed it to the pigs. And what happens to the pig that eats it?
They get sick.
They get sick.
And die.
And die. And you see, that's why it's so hard to control, because China's a huge country. The standard of living and the regulations is so much less. The government can say what they want to say, but to control it with the people. And here's the bottom line right here. Way down here, I hope you can see this. A 10% reduction, let's believe the USDA number here, 10% reduction of 5.5 million metric ton of pork production. That's a usage reduction of 15 million metric ton of corn. 15 million metric ton of corn is only 590 million bushel. So if the trade is right, and this is a 30% reduction in the hog number, that's only 1.5 billion bushel of corn demand that disappears. And what about beans? You know, you also need about 5 million metric ton of soybeans to produce this amount of pork, that 10% reduction. And that 5.5 million metric ton of soybeans, that's 183 million bushel. So if it's 3 times that, it's only 500 million bushel of beans that China doesn't need to buy to make meal for the hogs. And folks, the scary thing is, this disease is not under control yet. There are some areas of China where the loss has been 60 to 65%. Is anybody else concerned about this, or is it just me? There are people in the world concerned about it.
Isn't it interesting that 15 million metric tons of corn they won't need is awful close to the million they told us they were
Yeah,
gonna buy?
yeah. But they might need to buy corn not for feed, but they might need to buy corn for ethanol if they run short on that. You know, here's another area where it makes it so tough to try and control in China. And this is hard to believe, but look at those numbers. That 713 or whatever it was, as far as the, huge hog number. 10 years ago they had over 28,000 slaughterhouses in China. Well, they're trying to get control of this because, this type of thing, it's just so hard to control the way it is right now, because literally, if you go into a Chinese grocery store, I've seen pictures, they'll butcher a whole hog and just set it out there and you hack off what you want to take. And then you can go to the cooler and you can buy made in the USA pork with the Smithfield label. But they're trying to get control of it because, you have disease and issues like that can really happen to do that, but it takes time. And, this just shows the price spreads. You have some areas that are very expensive in pork for China right now because they've had huge losses and they can't get the pork. And then you have other ones where they've had early liquidations where prices are cheap right now. So you're getting a mixed view. The real effects are going to come 6 months, 12 months down the road, right? Because if you've lost 20% of your breeding herd, if and when you stop this disease, what do you use to repopulate?
You remember what happened when the pork shortage during the Olympics in China?
Yep. And what happened, the scary thing for the U.S., a couple things that are scary for the U.S. industry. Now, right now, it's really good. I remember reading a report from the University of Illinois in December of 2018 that projected the profitability for the U.S. hog industry in 2019. And was that report favorable or unfavorable? It was projected that the hog producers in the U.S. would probably lose money at least through September on every head of hog, every pig that they raised. Has that changed now with this bump in live hog prices? But the one thing that I've heard a lot of people in the hog industry talk about in the U.S., this is really good, it's really going to help us, we're going to make some money, but what tends to happen? We tend to expand too much, right? And too fast.
We need more.
Anybody remember 2008? When we kind of hit the wall there? You see, at some point, I can't tell you when, but at some point, China will be able to repopulate, and the whole world right now is going to gear up production to try and meet some of this lost demand. Or lost production, I should say. So here's kind of what we know. People on the ground in China feel that hog feeding is down 40% right now and growing every day. So we would almost expect or suspect that soybean meal could be down that much too. Remember what we talked about at the beginning? U.S. bean stocks as high as they've ever been. Bigger crops, total crop in South America, so their stocks are bigger than what they were a year ago. And your number one customer who was buying 70% of the beans out of Brazil, Argentina, and the U.S. is possibly down on demand 40%. Makes you want to plant more beans this year, right? I think we should just all plant cannabis. But I think you're limited to what, 40 acres according to federal rules or something, and you got to get it approved by the state. 80% of their breeding farms have reported to the government that they have the swine fever. 60 to 70% of the major farms. As we've talked about, the structure of the whole industry and the way they handle meat and the way they raise hogs over there, it makes it almost impossible to try and contain. I guess we just have to keep praying that they come up with some type of vaccine, because there are people in China that have made the comment, the only way to stop this disease may be to kill every hog. And I think government policy right now, if you have had the disease on your site, you're not supposed to even think of repopulating for 6 months. But right now, if they've lost at least 20% of their breeding stock, when they go to try and repopulate, what are they going to do? They have a lot of restrictions on bringing breeding stock in, so the world could change. If we can keep it out of the U.S. and keep it out of Europe, the rest of the world is going to have to make a lot more what? Meat, right? And that's going to take corn and beans, but it's going to take some time. So it's not all negative. Somebody asked about, do they export a lot of pork? Well, they have 55% of the hogs, but they consume 49% of global pork. So if they export, it's probably not a lot, right? If prices get too high or pork's not available, they're going to feed their people something, right? It could be chicken, could be beef, but look at these numbers. China today consumes 28% of all the meat raised in the world. If you lose 40% or more of their number one food item, first of all, what's going to happen to the price of food in China?
They will eat some of that corn.
I don't know.
Do they
Some-
allow, do they allow them to eat the sick hogs?
What's that?
Do they allow them to eat the sick hogs?
Well, I don't think they're really supposed to, but since humans don't get sick from eating it, I think it's probably happening. Or they may, if in fact a sick pig would live for 10 days, if you have one that gets sick and died, and you've got 49 other ones on the farm, what are you probably going to do? Sell them and butcher them. And not tell anybody. Because if you tell the government, they're going to come and take them and kill them and burn them. So, kind of mind-boggling, right? Prices will need to stimulate a huge increase in global meat production, and then we can kind of get into the positive side of things, the fact that to make that meat, it's going to take corn, it's going to take meal. Little different perspective, and this goes back, this is kind of old data, but it puts it in perspective. If we look at the pig stocks of the world, of course, China's way above everybody else. The U.S., a fraction of that. But basically, a 15% loss in China would be every hog in the U.S. So if you believe the trade and they're at 30%, that would be every hog in the U.S. times 2. Is that a big deal? And here's the pork sales. A few weeks ago, China came in and made a purchase of about 28,000 on pork in one of the export sales reports that come out on Thursday. We thought that was big because it had been the biggest purchase they had made in over 5 years, I think, or maybe even 10 years. And then this last week, when we had the snow and ice storm, they came in with a report of 77,000. But I will remind you, this was the export sales report. From what I'm being told, not 1 pound of this pork has been shipped yet. So is it real or is it not? If this is real, this type of demand coming into China now, Chinese government is probably saying, we're going to buy this now because the price is going to do what? Like I said, fill your freezer. Might even be worth buying a freezer. Let's talk weather for just a little bit. Craig Solberg, you may have heard him on the radio years ago. I think at one time maybe he was even on KDOM. He worked for Freeze Notice for a while. Anyway, been in the meteorologist for a long time. He put this chart together that looks at the Palmer Drought Index, and that's kind of gives you an idea of what the soil moisture profile is like. This goes all the way back to 1900, as of March 1st. And this is where we're at this year. Are we wet? And this isn't just Minnesota. This is nationwide average. And this was before, I don't know what you guys got, but in Fulda last week, first we had 2 inches of rain. Then we had about 3/4 of an inch of ice. And then we had rain. And then we had about 11, 12 inches of wet snow. So probably not getting any drier out there, right? Yes?
I had my rain gauge out through all of that.
Yeah.
I dumped it on the weekends. And when it all melted, what was in it? 2.6.
2.6, yeah.
Now, that's accurate? I don't know.
Well,
If that's accurate, but
I know
I'm
when,
surprised it was that much,
yeah,
really.
when we had, over in Fulda, we had like 1.7 to 2 of rain, and that same system that it went through over in the Pipestone area, they had 3 to 4. Just before we got any snow or ice. And the ground was pretty well cracked. My sump pump had just kind of slowed down at that point, and yesterday it was running every minute and 20 seconds. I felt good this morning because it was almost out to 3 minutes. So it's almost continuous. And we do not sit in a low part of town. But anyway, so we're starting out wet. As we look at this weather, my concern, and the market's not looking at this yet, my concern, for us to pick up 3.6 million corn acres from last year to this year, what kind of spring would have we liked to seen? Early, hot and dry. And in fact, even in Minnesota, where we're putting corn in the ground or thinking about it on the 15th of April, then you're going to pick up corn acres. Because the American farmer, if he can, likes to do what? Plant corn. Even if you're going to lose $1 a bushel, you're going to plant corn if you can. It's the American way. Huh?
How do you make money with corn? And losing $1 a bushel.
Yeah.
All more to town.
All more to town, yeah. Yields have saved us. Here's world weather, and this forecast came out on Sunday. For last half of April, we have temperature on the top, precip on the bottom, and you can see, well, not a lot of change, folks. I mean, we're not going to be at the 20 and 30 degrees the way we were a week ago, but still projected for us to be normal to below normal. Now, out east, they're a little bit above, but when we look at the precip, we're more in a normal pattern, just on the edge of being on the wet side, but Iowa, and this above normal, you know, the eastern corn belt's warm and wet. Well, how much corn are you going to plant then? But here's what the market's focusing on. They said, don't worry about this. It's only April. Because when you get to May, normal temperature for us, above normal in the eastern corn belt. And look at this, near to below normal on precip. So what are you talking about? No need to worry. You can plant the corn crop in 5 days, so just wait until the 1st of May. What if we get to the 1st of May and we're still looking at this forecast? Maybe at some point we add some risk premium in. Today the market is not concerned. And Commodity Weather put out this long-term outlook. You know, once again, we're looking at this big acreage number of 92.79 million acres of corn. So the market's saying, well, what's the weather going to be like? And this is off of the assumption, Commodity Weather said this forecast is off the assumption that the El Nino that we've been in for an extended time in the U.S. gradually fades and dies by like May or early June. And if that happens, we should see temperatures be slightly above normal as we get into the last part of our growing season in July and August. So that's a little bit of hope too, right? Even if it's not going to kill the crop, we might get some volatility in here. You can see a lot of heat in the western United States if in fact this verifies. But when you look at the precip map, you can see most of the heart of the corn belt having normal to above normal precip. So if you're warm and wet, the market will look at that and say, big acres, warm and wet, whew, how big is this corn crop going to be, right?
Rain makes grain.
Rain makes grain. Before we talk about prices, or as we get into the price discussion, this is from Arlen Sunderman. He's an analyst for INTL FC Stone. Honestly, one of the most down-to-earth guys you could ever meet, and one of the most intelligent guys when it comes to commodity analysis. He's a close friend of ours and more than willing to share information. He likes to get the information out. A lot of the information that we had today, you know, has come from Arlen in a roundabout way. But he always says, you know, the price of commodities, jumped ahead too far, it's a function of supply and demand, and that's what we've been talking about. You know, how much we raise, how much we use, that's the fundamental factors. But it's modified by the flow of money. Because as the Jerry Maguire movie taught us years ago, show me the what?
Show me the money.
Show me the money, and the money will move the market, regardless of what the fundamentals say. So we look at where the money is at right now, the managed money crowd. And as of yesterday, when we had another washout on the corn market, they're short almost 300,000 contracts of corn on the doorsteps of our growing season when we have a spring like this. That is abnormal. When is the greatest period of risk for raising a crop? Right now, right? Before we even get it in the ground. And the funds say, don't worry about it. They're short up to their eyeballs. It's a record type short for this type of for this time of the year. So all of this news we looked at, they must believe it and then some. But one thing we know about these funds that are short these type of positions, if they've been short corn and riding the price down, what do they have to do to lock in their profits? Have to buy it back. I don't know when, but I think at some point in time, just history tells us that eventually they're going to get back to even. How quickly they do it, it takes some type of spark. It could be a trade agreement. But the offset is, you know, you've got this negative news floating around about big stocks, big acres, loss of demand in China. So for now, they wait for that spark to come. Short about 76,000 contracts of beans. Quite honestly, if it was just the opposite, if they were short 300,000 beans and short 70,000 corn, I might buy it. I might believe it. Because the bean numbers are that negative. But the reason the bean market is higher than what I think it should be and what the fundamentals think it should be is that the money's not doing what? They are not pushing that bean market down yet. John Stewart and Associates put this analysis together, and they looked at old crop stocks to use ratios here, which years that were comparable, and then new crop stocks to use ratios, and this was before yesterday's washout, but looked at other years where they had been short corn this time of the year with similar type stocks to use ratios. And then they take it to a price down here. And basically what it shows is until we get about past the 4th of July, even with the funds being short and even with these big stocks, the market tends not to go a lot lower. So you've got a little bit of time here to hope that something gets worked out, that we see some short covering, that we see this market bounce a little bit.
You know how much the total funds have been short corn and soybeans at the same time, or is there a limit to how much money they're putting in these funds, and so they got so much in both corn and soybeans they can't switch it, they can't get more money in, or is there a limit on it?
I don't think there's a limit on it. You know, and I think most of those, you know, some of your trading funds and stuff are, you know, they set percentages on what they want invested, and it can be a percentage of their portfolio, but if their portfolio is getting bigger, it can be a moving target. Looking at a daily continuation chart of nearby corn. Now, before yesterday, the market was really hopeful that we would hold this area around 361 nearby corn, which is now the May contract. The continuation chart just keeps marching forward as March goes off, May becomes the lead. So yesterday we closed a little bit below that. By doing that, you know, it looks like we're maybe on par here to work our way down a little bit and test this support around 352 to 355. One thing I want to point out here is we like to watch the RSI, or Relative Strength Index. When the RSI is up above 70 or in the 80s, the market is overbought, like it was here. In that type of situation, the market is due for a correction down. You know, follow that. That's listening to the market. Likewise, when the RSI gets down close to 20 or below, I've seen that some years get down even 10 to 12. Close to 20, the market's oversold, like it was in March 12th here. And look what the market did as short covering came in. So if for some reason the funds decide to cover some of this short position, my opinion, it could easily result in a 20 to 25 cent rally in corn futures, regardless of the fundamentals changing or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So be thinking about that as you put your marketing plan and your sales goals together. Looking at a weekly chart of continuation chart of corn, we can see, I feel your pain. We have not been above $4 futures other than this false breakout in 2018 when we thought we had a drought going. We haven't been above $4 futures for almost 3 years. And the fundamentals today say it could be another year. And I think that's why there's a lot of concern out there, but you know, it also shows you that on a weekly basis, each and every year, we get opportunities at better prices, don't we? And we just kind of have to have a plan together and use that accordingly. Okay, December corn on the new crop side. This is a weekly chart. I think futures right now are trading somewhere around, what, 385? Before yesterday, I think they were around 390. So let's just assume that this short covering gives us a 20 to 25 cent rally. Could possibly get December futures up to that 410 to 415 area. Is that an area we could possibly look at as a target? Well, if you look at this weekly chart, we have 19, 18, 17, 16, and part of 15. And if we go right here at about 410 to 415, you see what? Does it happen each year?
Chance every year.
Every year we get a chance. But this is a weekly chart, so like this one right here, how long did it last? Could have been 1 day, but it was 1 week on the chart, one blip. So basically what I'm telling you is we need to have some orders together. Do it now. I'm not telling you to sell now, but it looks like we're going to get a chance. But what happens? When we get this type of thing, what happens? We read the newspaper and it says that the corn market's going to do what?
Keep going higher.
Keep going higher. So we lose our discipline, and then all of a sudden we're down here saying, geez, I wish I would have sold because that was quite a drop. That makes a big difference, right? What about beans? Beans on the nearby continuation chart really been kind of in a sideways to a little bit lower pattern. This 880 area seems to be some support. We'll just have to see. The same rules apply on the RSI. Close to 80, markets overbought. Close to 20, markets oversold. When you look at the fundamentals and you look at the potential of a demand reduction by the #1 customer of soybeans in the world, folks, I can only tell you to be careful with beans because I'm pretty neutral, still want to be friendly on corn, but the bean thing is potentially quite negative. Weekly chart of beans, once again, it's kind of up to the money, even though they're short. Beans in a smaller way. You notice here from last fall, on a weekly chart, we're actually in an uptrend on beans. And the numbers really don't say we probably should be. Now I'll point out one other thing on this weekly chart. If you draw a line off your uptrend here on a short-term basis and bring it up here, it looks like we're kind of building the market into what?
Flag consolidation.
Could be a flag or it could be the apex of a triangle. And when it breaks out of that apex, it can be pretty violent one way or the other, right? And right now, today, I can't give you a case that says it should break out to the upside. That same conference we were at in March, the guy jokingly said, and this was before we had the stock surprise on corn, found more corn, but he wanted to be friendly corn. And he said, honestly, you're going to laugh at me, but he said the fundamentals right now today say we could go to $5 corn and $5 beans at the same time in Chicago. New crop beans. I really think that the market is being somewhat supported by the fact that they think we're going to plant 4.5 million less bean acres. But here's a scary thing. If this Chinese demand really drops off that much, even with a trade agreement, even with less bean acres planted in the U.S., we could see bean stocks go up next year to 1.3 to 1.4 billion bushel. And all of a sudden we've, I think, gotten a false sense of security that, 8 to 900 million bushel carryout on beans is no big deal. Do you remember just a few years ago when that carryout was projected at 92 million bushel? Different world, right? Okay, closing bid page from yesterday. Remember that first question I asked you? What is the market telling us? That's what we need to answer now. Before we get into this, I want to talk about the 3 types of a cash grain market. First one is a flat market. In a flat market, you'd be looking at corn like from May all the way out to September. The price is what?
Steady.
Steady, it's flat. In a flat market, what is the market telling you to do? Does it matter when you sell?
No.
No. In fact, if you got money borrowed, you want to probably sell up here and pay your note off, right? Second type of market is a carrying charge market. Here's an example of a carrying charge market. Corn off the combine in November, 342. Corn off your farm in June of 2020, 371. 29 cents higher. That's a carrying charge market. The market is paying you 29 cents to carry the corn at home in your farm bin versus bringing it down off the combine. In a carrying charge market, if you have farm bins and farm storage, what is the market telling you to do? What do you sell? Do you sell here?
No, storage.
You sell here. You store it on the farm. You pay yourself the carry of 29 cents a bushel. third type is an inverted market. Inverted market is where your lead month is higher than your corresponding future months. Now, granted, it's only a penny. I think Keith is doing this on purpose because when we started these meetings, it was like 3 cents. Now it's down to a penny.
That's the kind of guy he is.
Is that right? This, though, is an inverted market. What is the market telling a producer to do with the inverted market? When do you sell? Today. And if you don't believe that, then I've got a proposal for you. And this is not swampland in Florida. But if you've got 50,000 bushel of corn at home on the farm, I want you to take that 50,000 bushel, take it times 1 penny, and write me a check for that amount. And you're going to say, I'd be a dang fool to do that because I'd be losing money. What's the market telling you? When is the last time you could sell corn at 15 under the May for a basis? I'm not telling you to sell it and forget about it. You could do that because 344 is very close. Does anybody remember? We didn't talk about that today, but the average price projected by the USDA for cash corn in this crop year is now $3.50 a bushel. So we're not that far away. But you can do a basis contract and wait to see if we get a trade agreement with China, if we get some short covering by the funds, if the weather creates some risk premium, which I still think it could. But somebody made the comment before, you know, here we are, April 17th. By September 1st, by Labor Day, we want the bins empty. If this corn market does start working its way higher and the farmers start showing it some love and making some sales, what's probably going to happen to this basis? And if you say, I can't sell corn for April, there's still road postings on, my yard's messy, it's raining more, okay, I understand that, I agree with that. But then look at this summer basis where you know it's going to be hot and dry at some point, and this basis at 24 to 25 under the July, that's not a bad basis for summer delivery. And remember, as we get into June, July, and August, what about the other exporters of corn in the world? Are they going to be more competitive or less than a year ago? And if we don't have that export market, then we're left to ethanol and feeding, and that probably is, at some point, they can only use so much, so the basis possibly could go wider. Questions on that? On the new crop side, if you have farm storage, now if you're paying New Vision or any other elevator 3 to 4 cents a month storage, this doesn't work in a carrying charge market. But if you have farm storage, you want to look to sell the carry. With June of next summer at 371 today, if we were to get a 20 to 25 cent rally, which we've all agreed is a potential, that price could get close to what? $4 corn for next summer with Nobles County yields at 295 bushel. That works, doesn't it? I just want to see if you're awake and you're still listening, so that's good. That's good. We have to look for those opportunities. Don't forget about this, folks. I really think this is something that bears watching. And like I said,
It's pretty average, though, isn't it? 45?
yeah, it's pretty average, but I think it's probably better than what it has been, you know, the last couple of years. And better than what it could be if we're actually going to plant 92 million acres of corn and have decent weather, right? What about beans? There's a little bit of a carry out to this fall. We're still going to have too many beans this fall, in my opinion. I think the reason the market's showing this type of carry is they're concerned about the lower acreage number and what if we would have a weather problem in the U.S. Today it doesn't look like it. So on beans, really, it's kind of when it works best for you. The market's really pretty flat. Penny carry doesn't show much. And on new crop side, 836, there's about a 30-cent carry out in next summer. Now, if you're borrowing the money, if you have operating notes, your interest is going to eat a lot of that up, so it's a little less defined there. But you know, if you have a situation where you don't have a lot of notes at the bank, you could pay yourself a 30-cent carry by keeping beans on the farm too. Only on-farm storage works. And honestly, I think if we say today that corn could rally 20, 25 cents, just kind of normal things, and that's time of the year, let's just assume that we do get a trade agreement with China. I think even though all of these fundamental numbers on beans are pretty negative, if we get an agreement with China, could that give the bean market a 50-cent bump? I think it could, really for no good reason. And if that happened, and you've seen some of these prices in the deferred months for farm storage get up to $9 or better, if our carryout could possibly grow bigger next year, should that be something a person might want to keep in mind? Especially if you got 90 bushel beans coming out of the field? Oh, you went to sleep on that one, didn't you? Okay, Arlen put together a webinar after last Tuesday's report, and these were some of the take-home points, and it fits in with what we've talked about, so I said, well, we're just going to use it here too. The margin for error on corn remains small, but now it's pretty adequate with that stock surprise we had. Soybean stocks are large and getting larger, both in the U.S. and in the world. Most of the world's wheat is in China. Second highest is in the U.S. That doesn't have a lot to do with us, but it would be significant if China does buy some U.S. wheat. Spring weather is not yet a concern for the trade. I think we have to continue this pattern that we have, get closer to the 1st of May. Planting progress this last Monday, that comes out every Monday now, was 2%, but this time of the year it's usually pretty small. African swine fever is bigger than currently perceived, and in our opinion, not under control yet and getting bigger. China trade deal is a big unknown as we go forward, and I really think that we will, maybe it's just that I'm an optimist too, that we will get something done with China in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe the end of June, but I don't think it's going to take that long. I think there's enough pain in China that we need to get something done. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this. I had this last year in the April meetings and got nothing but positive comments. So I apologize in advance if you're offended by this, but we're now in Holy Week as far as a Christian faith, and Easter is the high point of what it's all about, right? We look at the commercial side and we hear talk of Easter bunnies and colored eggs and candy and all that stuff's good and fine. But really Easter, the resurrection of Jesus, makes Easter the high point of a Christian's life. It makes life worth living. Because when God is at work for you, there is nothing to fear, right? This last week, if it didn't reinforce having faith in something, I don't know what would. Assuming that we always have electricity, that we always have a hot meal, and then all of a sudden you go without that for hours or days, and all of a sudden you start appreciating some small things in life, right? We have to keep the faith. So, thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention. I apologize, got a little bit long, but there was really good discussion here, and if you can't tell, I kind of enjoy doing this, just a little bit. And besides that, you see, I've got this strange thing that I think I've been given a calling. Because last Wednesday, a week ago today, was my anniversary of my second life. And a friend of mine that I had kind of spaced off, because I was thinking on the weather and making sure ingredients got in on time before the storm hit last week, and a friend of mine sent this, and she said, oh, by the way, congratulations on living another 12 years. 12 years ago last Wednesday was my heart surgery. When they put me on the table, they didn't know if I was going to come out alive or not. And when I got out of there, I struggled for a long time with why am I still here? And somebody pointed out to me and said, you know, well, just look at your job for one thing. You've got 30 plus years of experience. You've got a lot of things to share. Maybe the good Lord wants you to share that with people that could use some of that information. That's what I'm trying to do here today. So I appreciate that. By the way, I'm a rock fan, so I really like that when she had that picture on there. And don't forget to have a good Easter. Thank you for your time, and appreciate very much your business, and I hope this helps in just a small way.